I'm Abigail Garcia, 28 years old, and 6 months ago, my grandmother passed away, leaving me feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The woman who raised me, who taught me everything about strength and dignity, was gone. But what my family did next was even worse. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family while watching someone else get all the love and attention you deserved, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of deep generational pain. My story with Grandma Rose began when I was 7 years old, the day my parents dropped me off at her little brick house on Maple Street with a suitcase and a promise to come back soon. That was 21 years ago. They never came back, not really. But Grandma Rose, with her silver hair always perfectly pinned and her kitchen that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, she became my everything. I remember that first night, sitting on her floral couch that had probably been there since the 70s, watching her methodically fold my clothes into the dresser that would become mine. She didn't ask me why my parents left, didn't make me feel broken or unwanted. She just handed me a warm chocolate chip cookie and said, "This is your home now, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine." Her voice had this gentle authority that made you believe everything would actually be okay. Those early years were filled with small rituals that became the foundation of who I am. Every morning, Grandma Rose would wake me up by opening my blinds and saying, "Rise and shine, sunshine. Today's going to be a good day." We'd have breakfast together at her small kitchen table with the checkered tablecloth, always oatmeal with brown sugar on weekdays, pancakes on Saturday, and French toast on Sunday. She taught me to cook standing on a step stool beside her, my small hands learning to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, to measure flour level with a butter knife, to taste the batter and adjust the vanilla until it sings. When I struggled with math homework, she'd sit beside me for hours, her patience never wavering, using buttons and pennies to make fractions make sense. When kids at school teased me about my thrift store clothes, she taught me to hold my head high and remember that character isn't bought in a store, honey. It's built through kindness and hard work. At night, she'd tuck me in and tell me stories about her own childhood, about the importance of education, about dreams that were worth chasing. I felt so secure in that little house, so completely loved and protected. As I grew older, our bond only deepened. During my teenage years, when most kids rebel against their guardians, I found myself wanting to spend more time with Grandma Rose, not less. She never made me feel judged or criticized. When I brought home my first boyfriend at 16, she invited him for dinner and asked thoughtful questions about his college plans and his family. When I struggled with deciding on a major in college, she helped me make lists of pros and cons, but never pushed her own agenda. She'd say, "You're smart, Sophia. Trust your instincts." When I graduated with my degree in elementary education, she sat in the front row wearing her best dress and a corsage, tears streaming down her face as I walked across the stage. The photo of us after the ceremony, her arms wrapped around me in the biggest hug, still sits on my nightstand. She helped me get my first apartment, insisted on paying the security deposit even though I protested, and would show up with groceries just because I was in the neighborhood. She attended every school play I directed, every parent-teacher conference when I couldn't find anyone else to be my emergency contact, every birthday celebration I threw for my students. She was my biggest cheerleader, my safest place to land, my example of unconditional love. The golden period of our relationship came during my mid-20s when I finally felt established as an adult. I had a teaching job I loved at Lincoln Elementary, a cozy apartment across town, and enough stability to start really taking care of Grandma Rose the way she'd always taken care of me. Every Sunday, I'd drive over for our standing dinner date. We'd cook together. She'd insist on making her famous pot roast, even though she was slowing down, and catch up on the week. She'd tell me about her garden, her book club, the neighbors she worried about. I'd share stories about my students, the challenges of teaching, my small triumphs and frustrations. We developed this easy rhythm where comfortable silences felt just as natural as our conversations. She started letting me help with things she'd always been too proud to accept help with before. Grocery shopping, doctor's appointments, small repairs around the house. I'd find little notes she'd written herself on the refrigerator. Call Abigail about the leaky faucet, or ask Abigail about the insurance forms. It felt so natural, this gradual role reversal where I got to care for the woman who'd cared for me. We'd spend hours looking through old photo albums, her telling me stories about relatives I'd never met, about her young marriage to my grandfather who died before I was born, about the dreams she'd had and the ones she'd achieved. During these conversations, she'd often pat my hand and say, "You're my legacy, sweetheart. Everything good I've done in this world lives on in you." But there were subtle warning signs that I should have paid more attention to. Every few months, my cousin Bradley would call Grandma Rose, usually when he needed money. She'd always take these calls in her bedroom with the door closed, but I could hear her voice getting strained, hear her saying things like, "I understand you're struggling, honey, and let me see what I can do." After these calls, she'd seem quieter, more worried. When I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd wave her hand dismissively and say, "Oh, you know Bradley, he's just going through a rough patch." Bradley was my Uncle Jim's son, 3 years older than me, and the undisputed golden child of our extended family. Where I'd been quietly building a stable life as a teacher, Bradley bounced between get-rich-quick schemes and periods of unemployment, always with a story about how his failures were someone else's fault. But somehow, every family gathering revolved around Bradley's latest venture, or Bradley's potential, or Bradley's charm. The family spoke about him like he was destined for greatness, while my steady, responsible life barely rated a mention. I noticed that Grandma Rose had started keeping important papers in a locked box in her closet, and she'd become more secretive about her finances. When I offered to help her organize her bills or medical paperwork, she'd thank me but insist she had everything under control. One evening in early spring, I found her sitting at her kitchen table with legal documents spread out in front of her, reading something intently through her magnifying glass. When she noticed me watching, she quickly gathered everything up and said she was just taking care of some boring paperwork. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was shifting, that the secure world we'd built together was somehow becoming fragile. The day that changed everything started like any other Tuesday morning in late September. I was at school, setting up my classroom for a lesson on ecosystems, when my phone buzzed with a call from Sunny Meadows Nursing Care. The woman's voice was professional but gentle, as she explained that Grandma Rose had been found unresponsive in her garden that morning by a neighbor. The paramedics had tried everything, but she was gone. She'd apparently been picking the last tomatoes of the season, something she'd done every autumn for as long as I could remember, when her heart simply stopped. I remember dropping the phone and sinking into my desk chair, staring at the bulletin board covered with my students' artwork about their families, feeling like the entire world had suddenly gone silent. My principal found me there an hour later, still in shock, still not quite believing that the most important person in my life was gone. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and a constant stream of family members I rarely saw suddenly appearing to help with everything. My Aunt Patricia, Uncle Jim, and of course Bradley descended on Grandma Rose's house like vultures, immediately taking charge of all the decisions. They planned the funeral at the most expensive funeral home in town, ordered elaborate flower arrangements, and invited people Grandma Rose had barely spoken to in years. When I gently suggested that she would have preferred something simpler, more intimate, Aunt Patricia patted my shoulder condescendingly and said, "Oh, honey, you're too emotional to think clearly right now. Let the adults handle the arrangements." Bradley stood there nodding along, wearing a black suit that looked more expensive than anything I owned, already talking about the celebration of life, as if Grandma Rose had been his closest confidant rather than the woman he'd called, maybe 6 times in the past 5 years. The funeral itself was a surreal experience. The church was packed with people who spoke about Grandma Rose as if they'd been part of her daily life, when I knew for a fact that most of them hadn't visited her in years. Bradley gave a eulogy that made it sound like he'd been the devoted grandson, talking about precious memories and life lessons learned in vague terms that could have applied to anyone's grandmother. I sat in the front row, surrounded by family members who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 2 decades, feeling completely alone in my grief. After the service, person after person approached me to offer condolences, but they all seemed more interested in talking to Bradley, asking about his plans, his career, his future. It was as if I was invisible, even at my own grandmother's funeral. 3 days after the funeral, Uncle Jim called a family meeting at Grandma Rose's house to discuss her will and estate. I arrived to find Bradley already there, sitting at her kitchen table like he owned the place, going through boxes of her papers with my aunt and uncle. The moment I walked in, the conversation stopped, and I felt that familiar childhood feeling of being the outsider looking in on a family that didn't quite include me. Uncle Jim cleared his throat and announced that they'd found Grandma Rose's will in her bedroom, and that Bradley was the primary beneficiary. He'd inherited the house, her savings account, her car, and most of her personal belongings. I was left with some jewelry and a small cash gift. As Uncle Jim read the terms aloud, Bradley tried to look appropriately somber, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. She must have felt that Bradley was better equipped to handle the financial responsibilities, Aunt Patricia explained, as if this was perfectly reasonable. You know how she worried about your teaching salary, honey. She probably thought this would be better for everyone. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. This was the woman who'd raised me, who'd been my entire family for 21 years, who'd always told me I was her legacy. The idea that she'd leave everything to Bradley, who'd barely been part of her life, made no sense. But the will was there in black and white, signed and dated just 3 months before her death. As the family discussed logistics and timelines for transferring property, I felt like I was watching everything from underwater. Nothing they were saying matched the Grandma Rose. I knew the woman who'd planned every detail of her life with such care and intentionality. That night, I drove to my apartment and sat on my couch until morning, trying to reconcile the loving, thoughtful woman who'd raised me with someone who would leave me with almost nothing after giving me everything for decades. The dismissal came exactly 1 week later when I tried to have a rational conversation with Uncle Jim about the will. I'd called ahead and asked if we could meet at a coffee shop downtown, somewhere neutral where we could talk without the whole family dynamic getting in the way. Java Junction was busy with the lunch crowd, filled with the sound of espresso machines and quiet conversations. Uncle Jim arrived wearing his work clothes. He managed a hardware store and ordered black coffee while I got a latte that I was too nervous to drink. I'd spent days preparing for this conversation, writing down questions and concerns, trying to approach this logically rather than emotionally. I just want to understand. I began carefully pulling out a notebook where I'd written down timeline inconsistencies I'd noticed. 3 months before she died, Grandma Rose was still talking about teaching me to quilt next summer. She was making plans for us to travel to see her sister in Colorado. It doesn't make sense that she would have changed her will so dramatically without mentioning it to me. Uncle Jim stirred his coffee slowly, not meeting my eyes. Sophia, I know this is hard for you to accept, but your grandmother was getting older. Sometimes elderly people make decisions that don't seem logical to the rest of us. His tone was patient but dismissive, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. Bradley is a man, and he's got business experience. Your grandmother probably felt that he'd be better able to manage her affairs, deal with property taxes, handle the financial complexities. You're a wonderful teacher, but that's not the same as understanding real estate and investments. The way he said teacher made my profession sound like a hobby rather than a career I'd worked hard to build. I showed him my notebook, pointing out that Grandma Rose had always been sharp as a tack, that she'd been managing her own finances perfectly well, that she'd never expressed any concerns about my ability to handle responsibility. Look, he said, glancing at his watch, I understand you're disappointed, but questioning a legal document isn't going to change anything. Your grandmother made her decision, and we need to respect that. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became clear that Uncle Jim had no interest in actually discussing my concerns. Every question I raised was met with a pat explanation about Grandma Rose's declining mental state or Bradley's superior qualifications. When I mentioned that I'd been the one handling her doctor's appointments and helping with her paperwork for the past 2 years, Uncle Jim waved this away as basic caregiving, rather than evidence that she trusted my judgment. Bradley has plans for that house, he said finally, his patience clearly wearing thin. He's thinking about renovating it, maybe turning it into a rental property. Your grandmother would have wanted her investment to grow, not just sit there. The idea of Bradley treating Grandma Rose's beloved home as an investment property made my stomach turn. Besides, Uncle Jim added, standing up to leave, you got 21 years of free housing, education support, and care from your grandmother. Bradley never had those advantages. Maybe she felt it was time to balance things out. As he walked away, leaving me sitting alone with my untouched latte, I realized that in his mind, the decades of love and care Grandma Rose had given me weren't gifts freely offered. They were debts that somehow needed to be repaid to the rest of the family. 2 weeks later came the abandonment that cut even deeper than the will itself. It was the day of Grandma Rose's memorial service at the community center, a smaller gathering she'd specifically requested for her close friends and neighbors. I'd helped organize this event, working with her book club and garden club to create the kind of intimate celebration she would have wanted. The community center was decorated with photos spanning her entire life, tables covered with her favorite foods prepared by people who'd actually known and loved her. Mrs. Henderson from next door had brought Grandma Rose's favorite chocolate cake recipe. Mr. Martinez from the hardware store had created a beautiful display of tools from her garden. The atmosphere was warm and loving, filled with genuine stories and memories shared by people who'd been part of her daily life. I spent the morning greeting guests, making sure everyone felt welcome, sharing stories with people who remembered Grandma Rose's kindness and generosity. Mrs. Chen, who'd been in book club with her for 15 years, told me how proud Grandma Rose had always been of my teaching career. She'd light up whenever she talked about your students, she said, squeezing my hand. She said you had a gift for making children feel valued and smart. Tom from the post office shared how Grandma Rose would always ask about my classroom projects when she came in to mail packages to my students' pen pals in other states. These conversations felt healing, like being wrapped in the warm memory of who my grandmother really was and how she saw me. But as the afternoon progressed, I noticed that my family was conspicuously absent from these interactions. Uncle Jim, Aunt Patricia, and Bradley had arrived together, positioned themselves near the food table, and spent most of their time talking to each other, rather than mingling with Grandma Rose's actual friends. When people approached them with stories about my grandmother, they listened politely but didn't contribute much to the conversations. Bradley in particular seemed uncomfortable, checking his phone frequently and making small talk about the weather rather than sharing memories. At one point, I overheard him telling someone that he was just passing through town and would need to wrap things up quickly so he could get back to his life in the city. The most painful moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been Grandma Rose's closest friend for over 30 years, approached our family group to thank us for organizing such a beautiful tribute. She was an elderly woman who walked with a cane, and she'd clearly made an effort to dress up for the occasion in a navy blue dress with pearl earrings. Rose talked about all of you so often, she said, her voice warm with genuine affection, especially you, Sophia. She was so proud of the teacher you'd become, the way you cared for your students like they were your own children. As Mrs. Rodriguez spoke, I noticed my family exchange glances, subtle eye rolls, and suppressed smirks that they thought she couldn't see. When she paused, clearly expecting some acknowledgement or response, Aunt Patricia simply said, "Well, that's very nice of you to say," in a tone that suggested the conversation was over. Uncle Jim looked at his watch and announced loudly, "We should probably start thinking about wrapping this up soon. Some of us have real responsibilities to get back to." The dismissive way he said real responsibilities while surrounded by Grandma Rose's grieving friends felt like a slap in the face. These people had taken time from their own lives to honor a woman they'd loved, and my family was treating the memorial like an inconvenient obligation. Bradley immediately jumped on this cue, saying, "Yeah, I've got meetings tomorrow that I really can't reschedule." As they prepared to leave, making their excuses and avoiding eye contact with the community members who'd organized this gathering, I realized that they'd attended out of duty rather than love. They'd shown up because it was expected, but they felt no real connection to Grandma Rose's life or the people who'd been part of it. I stayed for another 2 hours, helping clean up and listening to more stories from people who genuinely cared about my grandmother, feeling more isolated from my own family than ever before. The demand came exactly 1 month after the memorial service, delivered with the kind of calculated timing that made it clear this had been planned in advance. Bradley called me on a Thursday evening, his voice taking on the artificially friendly tone he used when he wanted something. "Hey cousin, how are you holding up? I know this has been a tough time for all of us." After a few minutes of superficial small talk, he got to the point. "Listen, I've been thinking about the house situation, and I have an idea that might work out well for everyone. I'm planning to fix up Grandma's place and get it ready to sell, but I could use some help with the cleaning and organizing. Since you knew where everything was, it would really speed up the process. What do you think about coming by this weekend to help sort through her things?" At first, this seemed reasonable, even thoughtful. I'd been wondering what would happen to Grandma Rose's personal belongings, the photos and books and small treasures that held so much meaning. The idea of helping preserve her memory by carefully going through her possessions felt like something she would have wanted. "Of course," I told Bradley. "I'd love to help make sure her things go to people who would appreciate them." I spent the rest of the week thinking about which photos I'd like to keep, which books might go to her book club friends, which kitchen items could be donated to the church. I imagined us working together respectfully, sharing memories as we packed up a lifetime of belongings. Saturday morning, I arrived at Grandma Rose's house with coffee and donuts, ready to spend the day honoring her memory through the careful handling of her possessions. But the scene that greeted me was nothing like what I'd expected. Bradley had already started without me, and the living room was filled with cardboard boxes labeled "Sell," "Donate," and "Trash." He'd clearly been there for hours, working his way through her belongings with the efficiency of someone clearing out a storage unit rather than the home of a beloved family member. "Oh good, you're here," he said without looking up from the book he was examining. "I've been making pretty good progress, but there's still a lot to get through. I figure if we work hard today, we can have most of this cleared out by tonight." As I looked around the room, I realized that clearing out was exactly what he meant. Grandma Rose's furniture was tagged with price stickers. Her photo albums were stacked in the cell box, and her china cabinet was completely empty, its contents apparently already deemed worthless. The quilt she'd been working on for 2 years, a complex pattern in blues and greens that she'd planned to give to the church auction, was crumpled in the donate pile. Bradley, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, what's the rush? These things have been in this house for decades. Shouldn't we take time to really consider what's valuable, what has family significance? He shrugged, still not looking at me directly. Look, I get that this is emotional for you, but I can't keep the house off the market forever. The longer we wait, the more money we're all losing. Besides, most of this stuff is just old junk that nobody really wants anymore. The casual way he dismissed Grandma Rose's entire life as old junk sent a spike of anger through me. I walked over to the cell box and pulled out her collection of first edition books, volumes she'd collected over 50 years and treasured like old friends. These aren't junk, Bradley. These are valuable books that she loved. And look, I said, pulling out a photo album, these are family photos going back generations. You can't just sell our family history to strangers. Bradley finally looked at me then, his expression shifting from casual dismissal to mild irritation. Sophia, I understand that you're attached to this stuff, but we have to be practical here. Nobody's going to display photos of relatives they never met, and books just collect dust. If you want to keep a few small things for sentimental reasons, that's fine, but we can't treat this place like a museum. The few small things comment revealed how he really saw the situation. In his mind, I was being granted the privilege of selecting a couple of keepsakes from what was rightfully his property. The years I'd spent in this house, the memories attached to every corner of every room, the fact that this had been my home for most of my life, none of that seemed to factor into his calculations. What about her quilting supplies? I asked, pointing to the sewing room where Grandma Rose had spent countless hours creating beautiful handmade gifts for family and friends. She was in the middle of several projects. The quilting circle would love to finish them in her honor. Bradley glanced toward the sewing room dismissively. That stuff's going to Goodwill. I'm not going to spend weeks trying to figure out who might want a bunch of fabric scraps and old sewing machines. As the day progressed, it became clear that this wasn't a collaborative effort to honor Grandma Rose's memory. It was a business operation designed to convert her life into cash as quickly as possible. Bradley had obviously researched the value of various items, keeping anything that might be worth money and discarding everything that held only sentimental value. When I tried to explain the significance of certain pieces, the mixing bowls where she'd taught me to bake, the rocking chair where she'd held me during thunderstorms, the desk where she'd helped me with homework for years, he listened with polite impatience and then continued with his systematic sorting. I know these things mean a lot to you, he said in a tone that suggested my emotional attachment was a minor inconvenience, but I have to think about practical considerations. Storage costs money, and most of this stuff won't be worth anything to anyone who didn't know her personally. By evening, I felt like I'd watched Grandma Rose die all over again. Her house, which had been filled with warmth and personality that morning, now looked like a half-empty storage facility. The careful arrangements she'd made, the way she displayed her favorite photos, the books organized by topic and author, the kitchen tools arranged exactly where she could find them, all of that had been dismantled and sorted into cold commercial categories. As Bradley loaded boxes into his truck, he handed me a small shopping bag with the few small things he'd decided I could keep: a jewelry box, 3 photo albums, and one of her recipe cards. I think this covers the personal stuff you'd want, he said, clearly ready to wrap up the day. The furniture pickup is scheduled for Monday, and I'm hoping to get the house listed by the end of next week. As I drove home with my pathetic bag of memories, I realized that in Bradley's mind, this transaction was complete. Grandma Rose's house would become his investment property, her belongings would become his profit, and I would be grateful for the small tokens he'd allowed me to keep. 3 weeks later, the escalation began with a phone call that caught me completely off guard. It was Aunt Patricia, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that always made me nervous. Sophia, honey, I hope you're doing well. I know this whole situation with your grandmother's estate has been difficult for everyone. She paused, waiting for me to respond, but something in her tone made me wary. I wanted to call because Bradley mentioned that you seemed upset about some of the decisions that have been made. We're all family here, and we want to make sure everyone feels heard and respected. The words sounded reasonable, but there was an underlying message that I was being difficult, that my concerns were problems to be managed rather than legitimate grievances to be addressed. Listen, she continued when I didn't immediately respond. I think there might be some misunderstandings about your grandmother's wishes. Bradley and Jim have been talking, and we think it might help if you understood the bigger picture. Your grandmother loved you very much, but she was also worried about your future. Teaching is a noble profession, but it's not exactly financially secure, and she knew you'd never be able to maintain that house or handle the property taxes and upkeep. She made her decisions based on what she thought would be best for everyone in the long run. Aunt Patricia's explanation was delivered with the kind of patronizing concern that made my skin crawl. She was rewriting Grandma Rose's motivations to make Bradley's inheritance seem like an act of love rather than the betrayal it felt like. But here's the thing, Aunt Patricia continued, her voice getting slightly sharper. Some people in the family are starting to worry that you might be considering legal action or trying to contest the will. Now, I told them that surely you wouldn't do something like that, because you know how much it would hurt the family and cost everyone money and legal fees. But Bradley is concerned enough that he's been talking to lawyers about protecting his inheritance. He really hope it doesn't come to that, because family fights get so messy and expensive. And in the end, the only people who win are the attorneys. The threat was delivered with a smile in her voice, but it was unmistakably a threat. They were letting me know that they were prepared for a fight and warning me about the consequences of challenging them. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Aunt Patricia skillfully alternating between expressions of concern for my well-being and subtle reminders of why fighting the will would be futile and destructive. She mentioned how proud they all were of my teaching career, but also noted how expensive legal battles could be on a teacher's salary. She talked about maintaining family unity while making it clear that questioning Bradley's inheritance was equivalent to betraying the family. We just want what's best for everyone, she concluded, and sometimes that means accepting decisions that might not feel fair in the moment, but make sense when you look at the big picture. I know you're a smart girl, Sophia, and I trust you'll do the right thing here. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling like I'd just been expertly manipulated. Aunt Patricia had managed to deliver threats and insults while maintaining the tone of a concerned family member looking out for my best interests. She'd reframed my grief and confusion as potential family betrayal and positioned Bradley as the responsible party who needed protection from my unreasonable expectations. The message was clear: accept the situation gracefully, or face the full weight of the family's disapproval and legal resources. But the pressure campaign didn't stop with Aunt Patricia's phone call. Over the next 2 weeks, I started hearing from other family members I rarely spoke to, each with their own version of the same message. Cousin Michelle called to tell me how concerned everyone was about my emotional state and suggested I might benefit from counseling to help process your grief in a healthy way. Uncle Robert left a voicemail explaining how proud Grandma Rose had been of Bradley's business acumen and how she'd often expressed worry about my impractical attachment to the house. Even my distant cousin Jennifer, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, sent a Facebook message about the importance of honoring our elders' wishes and keeping the family together during difficult times. Each conversation followed the same basic script: express sympathy for my loss, reaffirm the family's love for me, suggest that my concerns were the product of grief rather than legitimate issues, and emphasize the importance of accepting the situation gracefully. But underneath each conversation was the clear implication that questioning Bradley's inheritance would make me the villain in this story, the bitter family member who couldn't accept their grandmother's final wishes and was willing to tear the family apart over money. The final escalation came when Bradley himself showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Tuesday evening. I was grading papers when the doorbell rang, and I was shocked to see him standing in my hallway with Uncle Jim beside him. "Hey, Sophia," Bradley said, attempting his usual charming smile. "Sorry to just drop by like this, but we were in the neighborhood and thought we should talk face to face. Can we come in for a few minutes?" The fact that Uncle Jim was with him immediately put me on alert. This wasn't a casual cousin-to-cousin conversation. This was a formal family delegation. Once they were seated in my living room, Bradley took the lead, his tone shifting from casual to serious. "Look, I'm going to be direct here because I think that's what Grandma Rose would have wanted. We've been hearing through the family grapevine that you're having trouble accepting her will, and some people are worried you might be thinking about challenging it legally. I really hope that's not true, because it would be a huge mistake for everyone involved." Uncle Jim nodded along, adding, "Legal challenges to wills are expensive, time-consuming, and they rarely succeed. More importantly, they tear families apart. Your grandmother wouldn't want her death to be the cause of family warfare." Bradley leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "Here's what you need to understand, Sophia. I've already invested a significant amount of money in preparing that house for sale. I've hired contractors, paid for inspections, fronted the money for repairs and improvements. If you try to tie things up in court, you're not just challenging the will, You're potentially costing me thousands of dollars in investments I've already made in good faith. The way he presented this information made it sound like I would be stealing from him rather than claiming what might rightfully be mine. Plus, he continued, I've been patient about letting you take your time with this whole grief process, but I can't put my life on hold indefinitely. I have business opportunities that depend on being able to access this inheritance, and frankly, your emotional attachment to the house is starting to interfere with practical necessities. Uncle Jim took over then, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used when I was a child. What we're hoping is that you can find a way to move forward without making this more complicated than it needs to be. Your grandmother made her decision for reasons that made sense to her, and second-guessing those decisions now isn't going to bring her back or change anything. The best way to honor her memory is to respect her final wishes and keep this family together. As they prepared to leave, Bradley handed me a business card for a grief counselor. I really think this might help you work through some of these feelings, he said, his tone suggesting that my opposition to his inheritance was a psychological problem rather than a legitimate concern. Sometimes when we're grieving, we can't see situations clearly, and professional help can make a real difference. After they left, I sat on my couch holding that business card and feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The family that I'd expected to grieve with me had instead united against me, presenting a coordinated front designed to pressure me into accepting a situation that felt fundamentally wrong. But their visit had also revealed something important. They were scared. Bradley's detailed explanation of his investments and timeline suggested that he was more worried about my potential challenge than he wanted to admit. The fact that they'd felt the need to make a formal presentation with backup support indicated that they saw me as a real threat to their plans. For the first time since this nightmare began, I started to think that maybe I wasn't crazy for questioning what had happened. Maybe Grandma Rose really would have wanted me to fight for what was right, even if it meant standing up to the entire family. That night, I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I made an appointment with an estate attorney to discuss my options. If my family was so determined to shut down any discussion of the will, maybe it was because there was something worth discussing. As I fell asleep, I could almost hear Grandma Rose's voice telling me to trust your instincts, sweetheart, the same advice she'd given me about everything from choosing friends to picking a career. My instincts were telling me that something was very wrong with this entire situation, and maybe it was time to stop letting other people convince me to ignore those feelings. The confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating came exactly 6 weeks after Grandma Rose's funeral. Uncle Jim had called a final family meeting to resolve any remaining issues with the estate and suggested we meet at Grandma Rose's house one last time before Bradley officially put it on the market. The timing felt deliberately symbolic, forcing me to have this conversation in the home where I'd felt safest and most loved, now emptied and staged for sale like any other piece of real estate. I arrived at the house 15 minutes early, using my key to let myself in and stand for a moment in the hollow shell of what had been my childhood home. The walls still held the faint scent of Grandma Rose's lavender sachets, but everything that had made this place feel alive was gone. The rooms echoed with emptiness, and I found myself touching the wall where her favorite photo had hung, the one of us together at my college graduation. Being in this space without her presence felt like visiting a grave. Bradley arrived first, followed closely by Uncle Jim and Aunt Patricia. They'd clearly coordinated their approach, because they immediately arranged themselves around the kitchen table in a way that put me facing all three of them. Bradley had brought a leather portfolio filled with documents, and Uncle Jim carried a briefcase that suggested this meeting was meant to be official and final. Before we get started, Aunt Patricia said, her voice carrying that familiar false warmth, I want you to know how much we appreciate your patience during this difficult time. We know losing your grandmother has been especially hard on you, and we've tried to be sensitive to that while still handling the practical necessities. Uncle Jim opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder of legal documents. We asked you here today because there are a few final papers that need to be signed to complete the estate transfer. Nothing complicated, just acknowledgments that you've received your inheritance as specified in the will, and that you have no further claims on the estate. He slid the papers across the table toward me, along with a pen. Once these are signed, Bradley can finalize the house sale, and we can all put this difficult chapter behind us. I looked down at the documents without picking them up. The language was full of legal terminology that I didn't fully understand, but the basic message was clear. I would be formally waiving any right to contest Grandma Rose's will or claim any portion of her estate beyond what I'd already received. This seems awfully formal, I said carefully. Why do you need me to sign papers saying I won't challenge a will that you insist is completely legitimate? The three of them exchanged glances, and I could see Bradley's jaw tighten slightly. It's just standard procedure, Uncle Jim said, his tone becoming more forceful. When there are multiple beneficiaries, attorneys recommend getting written acknowledgement that everyone accepts the terms. It protects everyone involved and prevents future misunderstandings. Aunt Patricia leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. Sophia, honey, I'm going to be direct with you because I care about you. We've all been very patient while you've worked through your grief, but this situation is starting to affect the whole family. People are talking, wondering why you can't accept your grandmother's final wishes. Some of the relatives are starting to question whether you're really as grateful as you should be for everything she did for you over the years. Bradley took over then, his charming facade finally dropping completely. Look, I get that you're disappointed. Nobody likes feeling left out, and I'm sure you had expectations about inheriting the house. But the reality is that Grandma Rose made her decision based on what she thought was best, and that decision was legally documented. Fighting it now isn't going to change anything except create a huge mess for everyone involved. He gestured toward the papers in front of me. Signing these documents is really just a formality. You're not giving up anything that was actually yours to begin with. The dismissive way he said anything that was actually yours triggered something in me that I'd been suppressing for weeks. Actually mine, I said, my voice getting stronger. I lived in this house for 21 years. I was the one who held Grandma Rose's hand during doctor's appointments, who helped her with her medications, who checked on her every single day. I was the one who knew she took her tea with honey, not sugar, and that she was afraid of storms, and that she saved every card I ever gave her in a shoebox in her closet. Where were you during those 21 years, Bradley? Where were any of you? Uncle Jim's expression hardened. Now wait just a minute, young lady. Just because your parents weren't able to care for you, doesn't mean you can claim ownership of your grandmother's life or her property. She took you in out of kindness, and you benefited from that kindness for decades. Free housing, food, education support, that was your inheritance, spread out over 20 years instead of given to you in a lump sum. The coldness in his voice was shocking. He was reducing the loving relationship between Grandma Rose and me to a business transaction, as if her care had been charity rather than love. Besides, Aunt Patricia added, her fake sweetness completely gone now. You're a grown woman with a job and your own apartment. Bradley has a family to think about, business investments, real financial pressures. Your grandmother understood that, and she made her decision accordingly. Just because you had an emotional attachment to this house doesn't mean you were entitled to inherit it. The way she said emotional attachment made it sound like my decades in this home were just sentimental nonsense rather than the foundation of my entire life. As they continued their coordinated assault on my character and my connection to Grandma Rose, I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope I'd been carrying since my meeting with the estate attorney 3 days earlier. Before I sign anything, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, I think you should see something I found. The change in their expressions was immediate and telling a flash of panic that they quickly tried to hide. I opened the envelope and pulled out a document that looked very similar to the will Uncle Jim had presented weeks earlier, except for some crucial differences. This is Grandma Rose's real will, I said, placing it on the table where all three of them could see it. I found it in her quilting room, inside the lining of her sewing box, along with a note explaining why she hid it there. The silence in the room was deafening as they stared at the document. According to this will, which is dated 6 months later than the one you've been using, I inherit the house, her savings account, and most of her personal belongings. Haid Bradley gets the car and a cash gift. Apparently, Grandma Rose discovered that Bradley had been pressuring her to change her will and had even brought some kind of legal document to her house that she felt forced to sign. But she was smart enough to create a new will afterward and hide it where only someone who really knew her habits would think to look. Bradley's face had gone completely white, and Uncle Jim was frantically reaching for the document, trying to examine it more closely. This can't be legitimate, Aunt Patricia sputtered. Where did you really get this? Did you forge it yourself? Or did you pay someone to create it? The accusation revealed how desperate they were becoming, but it also showed that they knew the document looked genuine. I found it exactly where I said I did, I replied calmly. Along with this, I pulled out a handwritten note in Grandma Rose's distinctive script. She explains everything here, how Bradley had been calling her for months demanding changes to her will, how he brought Uncle Jim with him to pressure her into signing a document she didn't want to sign, how she felt bullied and manipulated, but was afraid to say no because she didn't want to cause family conflict. She wrote that she was going to tell me about the real will when she felt the time was right, but she wanted to wait until after Bradley stopped bothering her. I looked directly at each of them as I continued. She also writes about how disappointed she was in all of you for treating me like an outsider at family gatherings, and how she'd always planned for me to have the house because I was the only one who'd ever treated it like a home instead of an investment. The room erupted in angry voices, with Uncle Jim demanding to know if I'd had the document authenticated, Aunt Patricia insisting that elderly people often write confused notes that don't reflect their real intentions, and Bradley frantically calculating what this meant for his renovation plans and house sale timeline. But underneath their bluster, I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew this document was real, and they knew their entire scheme was falling apart. The attorney I consulted has already verified the authenticity of both the handwriting and the legal language, I said, raising my voice to cut through their protests. This will was properly witnessed and notarized, and it supersedes the earlier document you've been using. More importantly, Grandma Rose specifically mentions in her note that she was afraid you might try to hide or destroy the real will after her death, which is why she took such care to conceal it. I stood up from the table feeling stronger and more confident than I had in months. I'm not signing any papers waiving my rights to contest the estate, because I'm not contesting it. I'm claiming what was rightfully left to me. The house, the savings account, and most of the personal belongings you've already disposed of belong to me, according to Grandma Rose's actual final wishes. As I gathered my things to leave, Bradley made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. Even if that document is real, I've already spent thousands of dollars on this house. I've had contractors in here. I've paid for inspections and repairs. You can't just expect me to eat those costs. The entitlement in his voice was staggering. He was demanding compensation for improvements he'd made to property that had never legally belonged to him. That's between you and your attorney, I replied. I never asked you to renovate the house, and I certainly never gave you permission to sell off Grandma Rose's belongings. If you made investments based on false assumptions about your inheritance, that's not my responsibility. As I reached the door, I turned back one final time. For 21 years, Grandma Rose was the only family I could count on. She taught me to be strong, to stand up for what's right, and to never let anyone make me feel small. What you've done to her memory, and to me over these past few months would have broken her heart, but she also would have been proud to see me fight back. This house was my home long before it was your investment opportunity, and it's going to stay my home. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a whirlwind of legal activity and family chaos. Within hours of leaving that final meeting, I received angry phone calls from Uncle Jim threatening to fight this thing every step of the way, and from Aunt Patricia accusing me of destroying the family over greed. Bradley left several voicemails that grew increasingly desperate as he apparently consulted with his own attorney and realized the strength of my legal position. The tone of his messages shifted from angry to pleading, asking if we could work something out that would allow him to recover his renovation costs and still profit from the house sale. But the most satisfying call came from my estate attorney, who confirmed that the real will was indeed legally binding, and that Bradley's hasty sale of Grandma Rose's personal belongings had actually strengthened my case. When someone disposes of estate property without proper legal authority, it can be considered conversion or even theft, she explained. The fact that he sold items that belong to you according to the legitimate will gives us additional grounds for damages beyond just reclaiming the real estate. Within a week, we had filed papers with the probate court to recognize the authentic will and begin the process of reversing the fraudulent estate transfer. The legal process moved more quickly than I'd expected, partly because Bradley's attorney quickly realized they were in an indefensible position. The authentic will was clearly genuine, properly executed, and more recent than the document they'd been using. More damaging was the discovery that Uncle Jim had actually witnessed Grandma Rose signing the fake will, despite later claiming he'd simply found it among her papers. When faced with potential charges of fraud and elder abuse, the family's united front crumbled rapidly. Uncle Jim was the first to break, admitting that Bradley had pressured him to help convince Grandma Rose to change her will and that they'd known she was reluctant and confused about the legal implications. Within 6 weeks of the confrontation, I had full legal ownership of the house and access to Grandma Rose's savings account. Bradley was ordered to return any personal belongings he still possessed and to provide an accounting of everything he'd sold, along with the proceeds from those sales. The court also awarded me damages for the wrongful disposal of my property, which effectively meant that Bradley had to pay me for selling my grandmother's belongings without permission. The financial impact on him was severe. Not only did he lose the inheritance he'd been counting on, but he also had to absorb the costs of the renovations he'd made and the legal fees for defending his fraudulent claim. But the emotional aftermath was more complex than the legal resolution. On one hand, I felt vindicated and relieved to finally have justice for Grandma Rose and recognition of our real relationship. Moving back into her house felt like coming home after a terrible exile, and I spent weeks carefully restoring the rooms to reflect her memory and our shared history. I was able to track down some of her belongings that Bradley had sold and repurchased them, and several of her friends returned items they'd bought, refusing to accept payment once they understood the situation. On the other hand, the confrontation had effectively ended my relationship with most of my extended family. Uncle Jim and Aunt Patricia never acknowledged their wrongdoing or apologized for their treatment of me. Instead, they spread their own version of events throughout the family, painting me as a manipulative opportunist who had used legal technicalities to steal Bradley's rightful inheritance. Some cousins and more distant relatives believed their story, while others simply wanted to avoid taking sides in what they saw as an ugly family dispute. The few family members who reached out to support me were people I'd barely known before, relatives who had their own difficult histories with Uncle Jim's branch of the family tree. The most painful loss was my relationship with Bradley himself. Despite everything that had happened, part of me had hoped that once the legal issues were resolved, we might be able to have an honest conversation about what had driven him to betray our family bonds so completely. But his response to losing the court case was to double down on his victimhood, claiming that I had ruined his life and destroyed his business plans through my selfish insistence on claiming property that should have belonged to him. He never acknowledged the years of love and care that Grandma Rose had given me, never admitted that pressuring an elderly woman to change her will was wrong, never showed any understanding of how his actions had compounded my grief during the most difficult time in my life. 6 months after reclaiming my inheritance, I was finally able to begin the healing process that had been interrupted by the family's betrayal. Living in Grandma Rose's house again allowed me to feel close to her memory in a way that hadn't been possible during the months of legal fighting. I could sit in her rocking chair and remember the stories she used to tell, cook in her kitchen using the recipes she'd taught me, and work in her garden continuing the flower beds she'd tended for decades. The house slowly transformed from a painful reminder of loss into a celebration of the love we'd shared and the values she'd instilled in me. I also began reaching out to Grandma Rose's friends and neighbors, the people who had known and loved her independent of family politics. Through them, I learned more about how she'd talked about me in her final months, the pride she'd expressed in my teaching career, and the worries she'd had about Bradley's increasingly aggressive attempts to involve himself in her finances. Mrs. Rodriguez shared that Grandma Rose had confided her fears about being pestered by family members who suddenly seemed very interested in her will, and Mr. Martinez revealed that she'd asked his advice about finding a safe place to keep important documents away from prying eyes. These conversations helped me understand that my instincts about the situation had been correct from the beginning, and that Grandma Rose had been trying to protect both me and her own autonomy, even as her health declined. As I settled into my new reality as both homeowner and heir to Grandma Rose's legacy, I realized that the confrontation had taught me lessons that went far beyond legal rights and property ownership. I'd learned that standing up for what's right sometimes means standing alone, that family relationships based on obligation and manipulation are ultimately hollow, and that the people who truly love you will support your strength rather than try to diminish it. Most importantly, I'd learned that Grandma Rose's greatest gift to me wasn't the house or the money, it was the confidence to trust my own judgment and fight for my own worth, even when everyone around me was telling me to be grateful for less than I deserved. The final resolution came almost a year later on the anniversary of Grandma Rose's death. I had organized a small memorial gathering in her garden, inviting the friends and neighbors who had genuinely cared about her to share memories and celebrate her life. As I stood among the flowers she'd planted, surrounded by people who remembered her kindness and wisdom, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing since the day she died. The legal battles were over, the family drama had settled into a cold but stable distance, and I was finally free to grieve and remember without the distraction of fighting for basic respect and recognition. That evening, as I sat in her kitchen reading through the journal she'd kept during her final years, I found an entry from just 2 months before her death that brought tears to my eyes. She'd written about watching me teach a cooking class to my students' parents, how proud she'd been to see me sharing the skills she'd taught me, how certain she was that I would carry forward the values of generosity and care that had guided her own life. Abigail has become everything I hoped she would be, she wrote. Strong enough to stand up for herself, kind enough to help others, and wise enough to know the difference. Whatever happens to me, I know she'll be just fine, because she has the tools to build a good life and the courage to protect what matters most. Reading those words, I finally understood that the real inheritance Grandma Rose had left me wasn't the house or the money. It was the absolute confidence that I was worthy of love, respect, and protection, and that I had both the right and the responsibility to demand those things for myself. The family members who had tried to take advantage of my grief and loyalty had underestimated the foundation of strength she'd built in me over 21 years. They'd expected me to be grateful for scraps and to accept their version of events without question, but Grandma Rose had raised me to expect better and to fight for it when necessary. Now, as I continue to build my life in the home where I learned what love really looks like, I carry forward both her memory and her lessons. I've returned to teaching with a new understanding of how to help my students develop their own sense of worth and self-advocacy. I've deepened my relationships with the people who stood by me during the difficult months of legal fighting, and I've made peace with the family members I lost along the way, understanding that relationships built on obligation and manipulation were never as strong as they appeared to be. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the confrontation over Grandma Rose's will was never really about money or property. It was about recognition, respect, and the right to be treated as a full member of my own family. The relatives who tried to minimize my relationship with her and dismiss my legitimate claims revealed their own values and priorities in ways that couldn't be hidden or rationalized away. They showed me that they'd never seen me as an equal, never valued the love and care I'd shared with Grandma Rose, and never intended to treat me with the basic respect that family members should show each other. But in fighting for what was rightfully mine, I also discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed and learned to value relationships based on mutual respect rather than blood ties or family obligations. The friends, neighbors, and colleagues who supported me during those difficult months became a chosen family that has enriched my life in ways I never expected. And the house that I fought so hard to reclaim has become not just a home, but a foundation for building the kind of life that would make Grandma Rose proud, one based on integrity, kindness, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. If you've made it this far in my story, I want you to know that I'm sharing these details not just to process my own experience, but to offer hope and validation to anyone who has faced similar situations. Family betrayal during times of grief is unfortunately more common than most people realize, and the pressure to keep the peace or be the bigger person can make it incredibly difficult to stand up for yourself when you're already vulnerable and hurting. The most important lesson I learned from this entire experience is that you have the right to trust your own instincts, even when everyone around you is telling you that your feelings are wrong or unreasonable. If something feels fundamentally unfair or dishonest, it probably is, regardless of how many people try to convince you otherwise. Grandma Rose always told me that when you know something is right in your heart, you have to be willing to fight for it, even if it means standing alone for a while. I also learned that legal documents and family relationships are not always what they appear to be on the surface. If you find yourself in a situation where someone's final wishes don't match the relationship you knew they had with the people involved, it's worth investigating further rather than simply accepting what you're told. Elder abuse and financial manipulation are serious problems that often involve family members pressuring vulnerable adults to make decisions they don't really want to make. Trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right, and don't be afraid to ask for professional help in understanding your legal rights and options. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't make you greedy, bitter, or ungrateful. It makes you strong. The people who truly love you will support your right to be treated fairly and with respect, even if it creates temporary conflict or inconvenience. The people who pressure you to accept less than you deserve, who try to make you feel guilty for protecting your own interests, or who attempt to rewrite history to justify their own behavior, are revealing something important about their own character and priorities. If you're watching this video because you've experienced something similar, whether it's inheritance disputes, family favoritism, financial manipulation, or any other situation where you felt invisible or dismissed by people who should have protected you, I want you to know that your feelings are valid and your experiences matter. You don't have to be grateful for scraps, you don't have to keep the peace at the expense of your own well-being, and you don't have to accept other people's definitions of what you deserve. Building a life based on your own values and surrounded by people who actually see and appreciate you is not only possible, but it's what you deserve. It might mean making difficult choices about which relationships to maintain and which ones to let go, but the freedom and peace that comes from living authentically is worth whatever temporary discomfort those choices might cause. Grandma Rose used to say that the best way to honor someone's memory is to live the values they tried to teach you, and the most important value she taught me was to never let anyone make me feel small. If my story has resonated with you, if you've recognized your own experiences in any part of what I've shared, then I hope you'll take that lesson to heart. You deserve to be treated with respect. Your relationships deserve to be based on genuine care rather than obligation or manipulation, and you have every right to fight for what's fair even when it's hard. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether any part of this story felt familiar to your own experiences. I'd love to hear from others who have navigated similar challenges, and I hope that by sharing our stories, we can help each other feel less alone in these difficult situations. Don't forget to subscribe if this content has been helpful. I'm planning to share more stories about family dynamics, legal rights, and the process of building authentic relationships after experiencing betrayal or manipulation. Remember, you are worthy of love, respect, and protection, and you have both the right and the responsibility to demand those things for yourself. Sometimes the people who should provide them won't, but that says everything about them and nothing about your worth. Keep fighting for what's right, keep trusting your instincts, and keep building the life that reflects your values rather than other people's expectations. Grandma Rose would be proud of you for having the courage to stand up for yourself, and so am I.